Hello, this is Cami Sauce here, and if you're at this video, you're probably a big nerd like me, and you don't want to just know how to use the DPS calculator, but you want to know how it works and all the formulas used to make it work. So I'm going to go into great detail on a lot of different topics about TFT and showing you how the calculator actually works. So here is the same page shown previously, and this is the page with all of the TFT units stats on it. So first we could see that each unit has a health stat, an attack stat, their effective HP versus armor, effective HP versus MR, range, attack speed, armor, magic resist, starting mana, max mana, an 80 multiplier if they use one for their spell, and then a base damage for their spell. And then finally, how many times their spell is going to hit someone on average, and how many seconds they're locked out of gaining mana after they cast their spell. Okay, so starting to get into all of these different values and what they mean, because they're going to come back later for our damage calculation. Let's start with health. So the health of each TFT unit is going to be some base amount for their 1-star value. And then when you get to their 2-star value, all it is always going to be your 1-star health value times 1.8. And then same for 3-star. 3-star is just a 2-star health value times 1.8. And that is true for every single unit in TFT, no matter what. So if you know the 1-star health value, you know the 2 and 3-star base health values. For attack damage, it's something very similar, where you have your 1-star attack damage, and then the 2-star attack damage is just the 1-star attack damage times 1.5. And then 3-star is the same thing. It is the 2-star times 1.5 as well. Okay, and then all of these other values are all set in stone. The only other interesting thing going on here is the effective HP versus armor and effective HP versus MR. So what effective HP versus armor means is if you have your health pool and you're getting hit by a unit dealing physical damage, how much is your health value worth versus that physical damage? And so the calculation is actually quite simple. All it is it says each point of armor you have gives you 1% effective HP versus that type of damage. So if I have 15 armor, that means my health pool of 500 as my 1-star Ash is increased by 15% versus physical damage. So that means we have 575 effective HP versus physical damage. And it turns out that every single unit in the game has the same exact base armor and MR. The only exceptions to these are Cho'Gath and Rammus. And Cho'Gath has a much higher base MR, and Rammus has a much higher base armor. These are both passives on these champions. Okay, so that is just a very quick rundown of what effective HP means. It is just how effective your health is versus that type of damage. Okay, going on into the calculator, what we have here is you're able to pick any champion you want, and then their stats are now going to auto-populate into this top bar here. So let's just take a look at Gangplank. Okay, so we see Gangplank's 1-star health, 2-star health, etc. 1-star AD, 2-star AD, 3-star AD, and then his effective HP versus armor at all the different levels, and his range, attack speed, armor, MR, starting mana, max mana, how long he's locked out of his ability after casting it, and then the crit chance and crit damage for every champion is the same. And then finally, we have his ability, and for his ability, it's not an AD ability, so we just put 1 for the AD multiplier. And then his base damage for the ability is 200 base damage at 1-star, 300 base damage at 2-star, and 450 base damage at 3-star. So how we could start to figure out how much damage Gangplank is going to do, there's a few things we need to do. We need to figure out how much damage per second is Gangplank doing from his auto attacks, and how much damage per second is Gangplank doing from his ability. And if you know these two things, you could add them together, and then that's how much DPS Gangplank is doing in total. So the first thing we want to do is figure out how much DPS is Gangplank doing from auto attacks only. And to do this, what we're going to do is we are going to get his AD at 1 star. And so this number for AD is just pulling from his base value, and it's adding on whatever your AD multiplier is. I should correct myself and say it is multiplying whatever your AD multiplier is. So for example, if I had a Deathblade equipped, that would mean I have a AD multiplier of 1.6, and I'm now working with 72 attack damage. Okay, and to figure out how much damage per second he's doing from autos, you're going to multiply that AD times his attack speed. So now we're figuring out how much damage he's dealing per second. And then the last thing we need to do is times that by his crit modifier. And so every champion has a base of 25% crit chance with a 40% crit that they would be dealing. So that's what this portion at the end is doing. Okay, and then when you multiply all those things together, that is how much DPS GP is doing at 1 star, 2 star, and 3 star, given these items. Okay, and then now for the more complicated part, it's figuring out how much damage per second any given champion is doing with their ability. So there's a few things we need to do. We need to figure out how much damage the ability is doing, and how many seconds and how many times, I shouldn't say how many seconds, and how many times that ability is going to be cast in a fight. And if you know those two things, how much damage you're doing with your ability and how many times it's cast during a fight, you can figure out the DPS you get from that ability. So to do that, we have our ability damage, and that formula is crazy, but all it is doing your base damage of your ability times your ability power modifier. And so each 1 point of ability power increases your base damage of your ability by 1%. So if I have 100 AP, that means that my base damage of my ability would get increased by 100%. So if I put in 100 AP here, we would expect our 1 star damage to go up to 400. And you can see that every single one of these values got doubled, and that is what our AP values do. So now that we have our ability damage, and it is being modified by the AP that we have, we need to figure out how many times are we going to cast in a given fight, so that way we can multiply that by our ability damage. So what we could do is we could figure out the seconds in the fight until we cast for the first time by getting the max mana, subtract it from our starting mana, and then we divide that by 10 because that's going to tell me the number of auto attacks I need to do as my champion to cast that ability. And so in TFT, if you're watching this video, you probably know that every single unit gains 10 mana per auto attack. So if I have 50 max mana and 0 starting mana, that means I need to auto attack 5 times to cast my first ability. And you can figure out exactly how many seconds that's going to be because you know how many times you hit in a second. That's your attack speed. Your attack speed is you hit 0.65 times in a second. So if you multiply that, you need to hit 5 times this 0.65. Sorry, times 1 over 0.65. You're going to get how many seconds into the fight until you cast for the first time. So it takes 7.7 seconds into the fight to cast for the first time. Then what we need to do is we need to figure out how many times until we cast the next time. And what's different between the second and first cast is the first cast, sometimes you're going to have a starting mana, which is going to affect it. And also, you're going to have the mana lockout after your first cast and every subsequent cast afterwards. So what the mana lockout is every single champion in the game has a 1 second mana lockout after their ability is cast. Some champions have a greater mana lockout when they're casting buffs or shields on themselves. They can't gain mana while their shield is active or when their buff is active, and that would also count towards that mana lockout. But at a minimum, every champion has 1 second mana lockout. So after his first cast, it's actually going to take a whole extra second to cast the next time because he still needs to do that 5 auto attacks. And he's going to have to wait that extra second from the mana lockout to cast again. Okay? So now we know how often our unit is casting. It takes our GP 7.7 seconds to cast the first time, 8.7 seconds to cast the next time. Now what we need to do is we need to figure out how many times he is casting per fight. And so to do that, we need to do one other thing first. And that is there's two different ways to gain mana. You could gain mana either by auto attacking, which we just covered, or you could gain mana by being hit by auto attacks. So here is where I'm calculating the damage. Let me backtrack. This is where I'm calculating the mana gained from getting hit by attacks. And so how the calculation goes is you gain mana equal to 0.0. Let me backtrack again. You gain mana equal to 1% of all the pre-mitigated damage dealt to you, and you gain 7% of all the post-mitigated damage dealt to you. So we have our pre-mitigation health bar and our post-mitigation health bar. All that is our raw health and our effective health. And since we always are going to have the same armor and MR as our unit, that means our effective HP versus armor and effective HP versus MR are going to be the same. And so here we're just doing that calculation to see how much mana we're gaining pre-mitigation versus how much mana we're gaining post-mitigation. And so it looks like between these two, just our natural health bar on Gangplank at 1 star is going to generate 45 plus 8. It's going to generate 53 mana for us, which is the equivalent to casting 1 extra time, approximately 1 extra time. So we figured that just by being hit by attacks, we're gaining about 1 cast of our ability. And then we could figure out how many other casts of our ability by taking the time left after our first cast, divide it by the times until the second and all future casts, plus this 1 for the very first cast of the fight. Whoops. Plus 1 for the very first cast of the fight. And then finally, I forgot if we said it, but we're adding the cast from being hit. And so it looks like from auto attacking and from getting hit, a GP is going to cast about 4.6 times per fight. So now we know how many times our GP is going to cast, and we know how much ability damage our GP is going to do. So we could figure out their DPS from ability if we just know one other thing, and that is how many times our a unit's ability hits enemies. So a GP just shoots a pistol at its enemy, so it just does 1 hit for every single auto attack. So to figure out the DPS from our ability, we just take the average casts per fight, we multiply that by the ability damage, and then we multiply that by how many hits on average our unit is doing. And then finally, we divide that by the 30 seconds in our fight. And so these gives us the values of our GP's ability damage per second. So if you want to know the unit's damage per second total, you're just going to add up the damage they're dealing from abilities and their damage they're dealing from auto attacks. And then you're going to get their damage per second total right here.